The letter had cost Arthur Vance $50 and the last of his pride. It was a sum wired to a man in San Francisco who promised solutions for lonely men on the frontier, a promise of a wife who could help him save the failing ranch that was bleeding him dry. The letter, which arrived by wagon freight a month later, was brief. It confirmed her name, Miss Shin, and her arrival on the noon stage in Prairie Ridge, Wyoming Territory. Arthur hadn't written back. He hadn't even gone to the station to meet the stagecoach. He had let her find her own way to the Widow Miller's boarding house, a hot knot of shame twisting in his gut. The $50 had been borrowed against a debt he already couldn't pay to Marcus Thorne, the very man who was slowly strangling his ranch. To bring a woman, any woman, into this disaster felt less like a solution and more like a final, desperate lie. He had pictured someone small and quiet, a woman accustomed to hardship, who would expect little and fade into the background of his failure. Facing her felt impossible, so he retreated to his work, mending fences that enclosed mostly dust and pretending the letter had never come. But Prairie Ridge was a small town, and secrets had a shorter lifespan than a summer rain. 2 days after the stage arrived, Reverend Miller rode out to his property, his face a mixture of pastoral concern and stern duty. "Arthur," the Reverend began, dismounting from his tired mare, "we have a situation." Arthur didn't pretend to misunderstand. He leaned against a corral post, the sun beating down on his worn hat. "I reckon we do, Reverend." "Miss Shin has been staying with my sister. She is a fine, composed young woman, and she understands the arrangement you made. The whole town understands it." The Reverend paused, letting the weight of community expectation settle in the dusty air. "The wedding is set for this Sunday. She has agreed. It would be a profound dishonor to her and to yourself if you did not see this through." Arthur felt the trap spring shut. He was cornered, not by law or by force, but by the rigid customs of a town that had already judged him. To back out now would make him not just a failure, but a scoundrel. It would give Marcus Thorne, his chief creditor, all the ammunition he needed to call in his notes and ruin him completely. He would be run out of the territory, a man who couldn't even honor a $50 bargain. "Sunday, then," Arthur heard himself say, the words tasting like ash. The wedding day arrived with a suffocating summer heat. Arthur stood at the altar of the small clapboard church, the wool of his only good suit itching at his neck. The place was packed. He saw the faces of his neighbors, their expressions a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. They were here to witness his final folly. In the front pew sat Marcus Thorne, immaculate in a tailored city coat, an expression of detached amusement on his handsome face. Thorne owned the bank, the largest herd in the county, and, for all intents and purposes, he owned Arthur. This wedding was merely entertainment for him. Arthur stared at the church doors, his hands sweating. He expected a woman in a simple calico dress, perhaps one borrowed from the Reverend's sister. He expected eyes downcast, a figure so unassuming she would barely register. He was prepared for pity. The old organ wheezed into a tune. The heavy doors at the back of the church swung open, pushed by the Reverend's boy. And the woman who stood there silenced every whisper in the room. It wasn't just a woman. It was a vision. She was not small, nor did she seem accustomed to hardship. She was poised and tall, her posture radiating a confidence that felt utterly alien to the dusty streets of Prairie Ridge. She wore a dress of the deepest scarlet silk, a color so vibrant it seemed to pulse with life. It was a foreign garment, with a high, stiff collar that framed her face, and a cut that followed the lines of her body with a startling, simple elegance. Golden threads had been worked into the fabric, forming the shimmering shapes of what looked like exotic birds in flight. In her hands she held not a formal bouquet, but a simple hand-tied clutch of wild prairie roses, their pink and white petals a stark contrast to the regal crimson of her gown. Her name was Leanne. She began to walk down the aisle, her steps measured and unhurried. Her black hair was swept up in an intricate knot, held in place by a single pin of dark polished wood. Her face was serene, her gaze fixed forward, not on him, but on the altar, as if it were a destination she had chosen with absolute certainty. A wave of sound moved through the church. It was not a murmur, but a collection of sharp, audible gasps. The women stared at the dress, a garment of such obvious expense and quality that it shamed every homespun frock in the pews. The men stared at the woman wearing it, at the unapologetic dignity in her bearing. This was not the mail-order bride anyone had expected. This was not some poor, desperate creature sold for $50. This was a queen arriving to inspect a barren kingdom. Arthur felt his own breath catch in his throat. He saw Thorne in the front row lean forward slightly, his amused expression replaced by one of sharp, calculating interest. The lie Arthur had told himself, that this was a simple transaction to get a pair of working hands, fell away. He had no idea who this woman was, but she was not what he had paid for. She was something else entirely, and as she reached the altar and finally turned to face him, her dark eyes calm and unreadable, Arthur Vance understood that his troubles had not ended. They had just taken on a beautiful, terrifying new form. The ceremony was a blur of formal words and the stifling scent of wilting flowers. The ride back to his ranch was conducted in a silence so complete it felt heavier than any conversation. Leanne sat on the wagon seat beside him, her back ramrod straight, the scarlet of her dress a defiant splash of color against the muted browns and grays of his parched land. He helped her down, his hand barely brushing her arm, and she gave a slight formal nod. Inside, the small two-room house seemed to shrink in her presence. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light settled on her silk dress. The rough-hewn table, the mismatched chairs, the cold hearth, it was all a testament to his poverty. He expected a reaction. Tears, perhaps, or a sharp intake of breath. He received nothing but a quiet, sweeping gaze that took in every detail without judgment. "The bedroom is yours," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'll sleep in the barn." She inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." The formality of it was a wall between them. He was her husband, yet she addressed him like a landlord. He retreated to the barn, the scent of hay and old leather a familiar comfort. He felt like an intruder in his own life. Over the next few days, a strange, silent routine established itself. He would rise before dawn and do his chores, and when he came in for coffee, a pot would be hot on the stove. She was always awake, dressed not in the spectacular red gown, but in simple, dark trousers and a tunic that allowed for easy movement. She never asked what needed to be done. She simply observed and acted. She swept the floors until they were spotless. She patched his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She started a small garden near the well, turning over the hard-packed earth with a focus he found unnerving. She did not speak unless spoken to, and her quiet competence was a constant, unspoken rebuke to the state of his affairs. The first crisis came a week after the wedding. Arthur rode out to check on his small herd of cattle, the last meaningful asset he possessed. He found what he had been dreading for months. A long section of his northern fence line had been cut, the wires snipped clean. The cattle, about 20 head, were gone. Their tracks led directly onto the sprawling property of Marcus Thorne. A cold dread washed over him. By territorial law, he had a right to retrieve his strays, but Thorne was an expert at using the law as a club. Arthur saddled his best horse and rode hard toward Thorne's grand ranch house, a place that loomed over the valley like a fortress. He found Thorne on his wide, shaded porch, sipping a glass of lemonade. He looked up as Arthur approached, a model of genteel hospitality. "Vance," he said with a pleasant smile, "to what do I owe the visit? Don't tell me you're already tired of married life." "My fence was cut, Thorne. My cattle are on your land." Thorne feigned a look of surprise. "Is that so? Well, that is a shame. Fences do fall into disrepair, don't they? Especially when a man is distracted." He took a slow sip of his drink. "My boys will be happy to round them up for you. Of course, there's a finder's fee, and a boarding charge for the grazing. Let's say $5 a head." $100. The number was a death sentence. Arthur didn't have 100 cents to his name, let alone $100. It was a perfectly legal form of theft, and they both knew it. Several of Thorne's ranch hands had gathered to watch, their smirks echoing their boss's contempt. Humiliation burned in Arthur's throat. He was beaten. He was about to turn his horse and ride away when a second rider appeared coming up the lane. It was Leanne. She was riding his old gray mare, not side saddle as a proper lady would, but astride like a man, her dark trousers practical and stark. Her arrival drew a fresh set of stares. She dismounted with a fluid grace and walked toward the porch, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the afternoon haze, clear and precise. "My husband's property is on your land. The law requires you to allow him to retrieve it." Thorne's smile tightened. He gave her a condescending bow. "Madam, it is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, but the law also allows for fair compensation for my trouble in securing the lost animals." "Indeed," Leanne replied, her gaze unwavering. She reached into a small leather pouch tied at her waist. Her fingers emerged not with a few coins, but with a single, heavy piece of gold. It was a double eagle, a $20 gold piece, and it glittered like a fallen star in the harsh sunlight. The sight of that much cash in one solid piece silenced the snickering ranch hands. She held it out to Thorne, her hand steady. "This should be sufficient to cover your trouble. We will be retrieving our cattle now, my husband and I." The confidence behind the gesture was absolute. She had not asked or pleaded. She had conducted a transaction. Thorne was momentarily speechless. He had built his power on the assumption of other people's poverty. To be faced with such casual wealth from Arthur Vance's bride was a shock. He could not refuse the money without revealing his true intention, which was not compensation, but theft. To be so publicly outmaneuvered by a woman, a Chinese woman at that, was an intolerable insult. With a look of pure venom, he snatched the coin from her hand. "Fine. Get your scrawny beasts off my land." As they drove the small herd back across the property line, Arthur felt a dizzying mix of relief and confusion. They worked together, wordlessly, to mend the fence. That evening, as he hammered in the last staple by the light of a kerosene lantern, she came out of the house with a dipper of cool water. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty, but filled with unspoken questions. He took the dipper, his fingers brushing hers. "Thank you," he managed to say. He took a long drink, the water soothing his raw throat. He had to ask, "Where did you get that coin?" She watched him, her face partially obscured in the flickering shadows. "It was part of my dowry," she said simply. "A small part." He stared at her. A dowry. A small part. The woman he had ignored, the woman he had been ashamed to meet, was not just composed. She was wealthy. And the question that had been a faint whisper in his mind now became a roar. Why would a woman of means travel thousands of miles to marry a broken man on a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere? He was beginning to suspect that she hadn't married him in spite of his troubles, but because of them. A sudden summer squall blew in from the mountains, trapping them in the little house for 2 days. The rain hammered against the roof in a relentless rhythm, turning the dusty yard into a sea of mud. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. Arthur sat at the table, mending a bridle, the scent of leather and oil filling the air. Leanne sat by the window, sewing. The needle moved in her hands with a hypnotic, deliberate rhythm. The silence was no longer hostile, but it was heavy with things unsaid. He found himself watching her. He watched the way the light from the window caught the smooth, dark curve of her hair. He watched her hands, which were not the soft, useless hands of a city lady, but were deft and capable. He was a man accustomed to solitude, yet her presence felt less like an intrusion and more like an anchor in the storm. On the second night, the rain finally softened to a drizzle. He saw her standing by the rough stone fireplace, looking at his father's old ledger on the mantel. It was a thin book filled with his father's sprawling script, a record of every debt, every loss, every failed hope. His own desperate entries were crammed in the final pages. "This Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet, not turning to look at him. "He owns the primary note on this land." It was not a question. The shame he'd felt on his wedding day returned, sharp and bitter. "Yes," he said, his voice tight. "He's been buying up the small homestead claims for years. He wants the water. My creek is the only one that runs year-round." "I know," she said. She turned from the fireplace to face him, and in the dim lamplight he saw a seriousness in her eyes that went beyond their immediate troubles. "My father did business with men like him in San Francisco, men who use paper and laws as a weapon, more effective than any gun." She walked to the corner where her things were kept in a single, intricately carved wooden chest. She opened it and removed a small lacquered box. From inside she withdrew a folded sheaf of papers tied with a silk ribbon. She untied it and held one of the documents out to him. It wasn't a letter. It was a land deed, crisp and official, with the seal of the Wyoming Territorial Land Office. He took it, his rough fingers fumbling with the fine paper. He read the description of the plot. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was the deed to the 160-acre parcel directly north of his own, the very land that contained the headwaters of his creek. That parcel had been owned by a California investment company for years, left fallow and forgotten. "How?" was the only word he could manage. "The man you paid in San Francisco," she began, her voice steady, "was an agent who arranged marriages. But that was a small part of his business. He primarily worked for my father. My father was a merchant. He was very successful. But in his world, success creates powerful enemies. When he became ill, his rivals began to circle, waiting for him to die so they could seize his assets. Under the laws there, and here, they argued he had no legal heir. A daughter did not count." She paused, her gaze distant, as if seeing a world far from this dusty cabin. "My father was a clever man. He knew his enemies would use the law against me, so he used it first. He secretly converted his liquid assets into land claims in remote territories, purchased under corporate names he controlled. He knew I would need a husband, an American citizen, to legally claim the properties in my own name and protect them. Our marriage is not about love, Mr. Vance. It is a business arrangement designed to secure my inheritance." She handed him another paper from the box. It was a letter, the characters of Chinese calligraphy flowing down the page like black ink rivers. Tucked inside was a second sheet with a neat, precise English translation. It was from her father. It laid out his plan, his love for his daughter, and his desperate attempt to give her a future he would not live to see. He had chosen Arthur Vance not because he was successful, but because he was desperate. A desperate man, her father had written, would be too preoccupied with his own survival to try and cheat her. He would be a shield. The deed in Arthur's hand felt impossibly heavy. It was her power, her secret weapon, but it was also her vulnerability. Without him, it was just a piece of paper. The storm broke the next morning. The world outside was washed clean, the air fresh and cool, but a new storm was gathering. 2 riders approached the ranch. One was Marcus Thorne. The other wore the badge of a U.S. Marshal. Thorne dismounted with a triumphant smirk. "Vance, Marshal Clayton is here from Cheyenne on official business." The marshal, a tall, weary-looking man with graying temples, tipped his hat to Leanne. "Ma'am, sir, I have a warrant to inspect this property. Mr. Thorne has filed a formal complaint with the territorial court. He is petitioning to have your land note called due on the grounds of insolvency and failure to make improvements. He further alleges that your marriage is fraudulent, a sham designed to shelter assets from legitimate creditors." Thorne was no longer using cut fences. He was using the full force of the law. He had a friendly judge in the territorial capital. He meant to crush them. The marshal looked from Thorne's smug face to Arthur's grim one. "The petition claims you can't work this one parcel, let alone 2. If the judge agrees, this homestead will be declared forfeit and put up for public auction. Thorne will be the only bidder." Here it was, the final choice. Arthur looked at the deed in his hand, then at Leanne. She stood beside him, her back straight, her face a mask of impenetrable calm. He could end it right now. He could declare the marriage a mistake, dissolve it, and send her on her way. She could take her deed, her gold, and find another husband, another shield, somewhere far from Marcus Thorne. She would be safe. He would lose the ranch, but he would lose it anyway. It was the sensible thing to do. But as he looked at her, he didn't see a business partner or a stranger. He saw the woman who had faced down Thorne with a gold coin. He saw the trust her father had placed in a broken man. He saw the quiet dignity with which she had turned his dusty house into a home. To abandon her now would be the greatest failure of all. He took a slow breath and met the marshal's gaze. "My wife and I will work this land," Arthur said, and his own voice surprised him with its steadiness. "We will honor the homestead claim on both parcels, and we will meet Mr. Thorne in court." He had just bound himself to her, and her to him, in a fight they had almost no chance of winning. He felt her shift beside him, a small, almost imperceptible movement. When he glanced at her, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not calm, not composure, but the faint, flickering light of hope. 4 months later, the aspens in the high country had turned a brilliant, trembling gold. The court date loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, but the ranch was transformed. The first thing they had done, using the legal access her deed provided, was build a small, sturdy levee of rock and earth at the headwaters of the creek. It was back-breaking work. They labored side by side from sun-up to sundown. It didn't stop the flow of water to Thorne's vast pastures, but it diverted a steady, reliable stream onto their own land. For the first time in 2 years, Arthur's hayfield was a lush, thick green. His cattle were fat and healthy. Leanne had worked her own miracles. In the rich soil near the creek bed, she had cultivated a garden of a size and variety that astonished their neighbors. Using techniques she said her grandfather had taught her, she grew rows of beans, squash, potatoes, and hardy greens that thrived in the high-altitude summer. Soon she was harvesting more than they could possibly eat. She began taking a wagon into Prairie Ridge once a week. The same people who had whispered about the strange China bride now lined up to pay cash for her fresh, perfect vegetables. She had created an income stream from barren earth. Arthur had built a root cellar for her, digging into the cool hillside behind the house, lining it with stone. He found he liked the sound of her voice as they planned the work. She, in turn, asked him questions about the land, about the cattle, about his father. The silence in the small house was replaced by conversation. He still slept in the barn, but it no longer felt like a banishment. It felt like a courtesy, a space he was giving her until the day he had the courage to ask her to share the house with him completely. He had come to admire her fierce intelligence, and she, he thought, had begun to see the decent man beneath the layers of debt and defeat. When the circuit judge finally arrived from Cheyenne, Marcus Thorne was waiting, his lawyer beside him, confident of victory. His case was simple. Arthur Vance was incompetent, his marriage a legal fiction, and his sudden prosperity a suspicious fraud. But the evidence spoke for itself. The judge, an impartial man with an eye for facts, toured the Vance homestead. He saw the green fields and the clear flowing water. He saw the healthy cattle. He saw the overflowing root cellar, a testament to a bountiful harvest. In town, he heard testimony from a dozen housewives who praised the quality and fairness of Mrs. Vance's produce. He saw a legal marriage certificate. He saw 2 valid land deeds being actively and successfully improved, just as the Homestead Act required. He saw a thriving enterprise, not a failing one. In the makeshift courtroom set up in the town hall, the judge dismissed Thorne's petition without even hearing his final arguments. The case was baseless. Thorne's attempt to use the law had backfired spectacularly, exposing his predatory methods to a federal authority. His reputation, the source of his power, was fractured. He left the courtroom a diminished man. That evening, Arthur and Leanne stood by the creek, watching the water gurgle over the stones. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. He looked at her, not at the memory of a scarlet dress, but at the woman beside him in a simple work frock, her hands stained with earth. "The ledger," he said, his voice quiet. "I used the money from the garden sales. I paid off the first of my father's old debts today, the one to the general store." She turned to him, and in the fading light he saw her smile. It was not the serene, polite mask she had worn for months, but a small, genuine curve of her lips that lit up her entire face. "It is our ledger now, Arthur," she said. He reached out, not entirely sure of his own intention, and his calloused hand found hers. Her fingers were small, but her grip was firm. They fit together. The arrangement had been about land and law, about survival and inheritance. But what had taken root and grown on that dusty patch of Wyoming soil was something else entirely. It was stubborn and quiet and real, like the prairie roses she had carried down the aisle. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.